Up until now, we have talked about the importance of explicit vocabulary instruction and teaching individual words. But this week, it is important to talk about keeping vocabulary work going beyond that initial introduction of word meanings and even beyond that explicit vocabulary instructional strategies we talked about. So each context that students encounter can add dimension to what is known about a word. And this need to work with words across multiple contexts becomes even more critical as students get further in their educational grades because words become more sophisticated, more multidimensional, and the distinctions among them much more subtle. So in this session, we'll be looking at the different parts of your instructional time and brainstorming ways to continue to nurture your space to support vocabulary growth with students. As we are exposed to words that are part of our environment, we pick up more and more precise information about their meanings. Meaning, if we want to get the most out of supporting vocabulary acquisition, we need to use every ounce of time to be intentional about coaching students to do the same explicit work that we do, sharing individual words as they go off and work independently. So to absorb new words, students need repeated exposure to those words in meaningful contexts. So outside of our explicit instruction, we absorb new words in these ways by having opportunities for active processing, when we read, when we learn new things, and when we engage in conversation. Remember, students are more likely to learn when they can actively engage with a word and its meaning rather than just passively receiving information from us. So in discussions about texts or new ideas, students have opportunities to use new words that are connected to their learning. Sometimes in these discussions, you can invite students to think very specifically about a particular word or context for that word. So you want to look for ways or opportunities to sprinkle these things in during your instruction. So it might be while you're discussing images or objects, you can say, what are similar about these? Maybe insects was the word that we were talking about. You can use movement. You can think about examples, compare and contrast the meaning of words. So what do you think the difference is between, giggle and guffaw? You can discuss multiple meanings of the same word. Look at the example for seasons, right? We have seasons that are summer, winter, and spring, but in the recipe it says to season the food. What do you think that could mean? You could talk about the meaningful parts of a word, about cognates, and you can even use new vocabulary during your writing. But the goal here is to be intentional and to plan for these things, or at least to be observant when they pop up in some of the texts that you introduce to students. Reading a lot is positively associated with vocabulary development. When readers comprehend a text, they can learn word meaning information for the few words they may not know in that text. And when I say read a lot for younger students, it really means that adults need to read aloud a lot. This provides students experiences with words and concepts that they cannot yet access independently as readers, but it provides some exposure. So to maximize the impact of this learning during read alouds, we want to be intentional about text selection, about explaining words before or during reading, and about revisiting important or conceptually challenging words after reading the text. So even for older students, importantly, the language of texts is different than it is for spoken language. So in everyday conversation, the goal is typically to communicate in a clear and straightforward way, and we can use immediate context to support our communication. So for example, we might say, can you flip that on while pointing at a light switch? Facial expressions, gestures, and the shared context really help to support comprehension of that direction, right? But in contrast, authors do not benefit from this shared context of body language, right? So they typically use more decontextualized language that is used to convey ideas that are beyond the immediate shared context. And this might include discussions of words that are imaginary or places that are far away. And they may use more figurative language because the goal is to help the reader feel a character's emotion or visualize a scene when they don't have those auditory or visual links. So authors of informational text may discuss categories. So why are spiders not considered insects? Or concepts, what is a community? Because of this specialized language, texts include vocabulary that we rarely use in everyday speech and provide lots of opportunities to expose students to new words. So the more students experience and learn the vocabulary of a text, the easier it is for them to comprehend new texts. In day-to-day oral language interactions, students are exposed to words in meaningful contexts, and the words we use often when we talk to students in our classrooms are the words they will learn over time. So if we regularly use sophisticated words such as "let's observe the weather," or "let's compare these texts," or "do you concur with Sarah's idea?" then students will begin to understand and use these words as well. So here are a few simple facilitation moves that you can use again and again to support students to use the words that you're teaching them as they talk. So you can respond to what a student is saying using new vocabulary. So if a student says it's cold, you might say, "Oh, you observed that your body feels cold today." You can invite students to add on to what they say. So your response to them saying it's cold might be, "You observed that your body feels cold outside today. What else did you observe?" You could encourage students to be more precise. If they say, there are some clouds in the sky today, you could ask them, how would a meteorologist say some clouds in the sky? And you might also use sentence stems. So, let's start by saying, "Today I observed," and then I want you to share what you recorded. Talk is a powerful teaching tool when it comes to vocabulary development. So we want to be intentional about using new words with students in our classrooms. So as an educator, we can use questioning as a way to push and flex and dig for a student's understanding of vocabulary. So let's look at this example on screen. As part of a science lesson focused on learning about forces, a group of kindergartners are moving toys and then describing how they made these objects move. And their teacher walks around the classroom and uses questions and prompts to help the students deepen their understanding of new ideas while applying the words push and pull in their observations. So the teacher might say, "So how did you make the toys move?" And a student would respond, "We pushed them or pulled them." "What do you mean by that? Tell me more." The teacher's asking questions. And the students respond with a little bit deeper of a context, right? People push them, then, you push them to make them do what? To move. Well, move, how do they move when you push them? It goes over there. And then the teacher continues in their questioning, right? And before this learning experience, the students could, probably use the words push and pull. But as they go through this effective questioning, now through their exploration and their teacher's prompts and questions, they are deepening their ideas about what those words mean. So the words have become this tool for learning and communicating in a particular discipline. Every topic, domain, or area of knowledge has associated vocabulary. So think about your own experiences of learning new things that may not have been part of your formal schooling. If you decide to start, running marathons, you'd probably learn and use terms like cadence and foot strike, or specialized running related meanings for words like splits or form. And if you decide to take up, gardening, you would need to learn plant names, hydrangea, plant parts like pistil, plant types, perennials, the word for some of the tools, so trowel and shears, the words for the work that you do, pruning and deadheading, including special gardening meanings for everyday words, so like a cutting or an annual. And all of this applies to school as well. In order to create opportunities for young students to learn new words, we need to build their knowledge of the world and make sure that they are learning new things. They need lots of time and lots of structure to engage in content area learning. And some ideas for these structures include open-ended questions like we talked about before after introducing new content, such as some of the things that we see on screen. Across different settings in your class, you will have to consider when and how you introduce words to students. So you can do this by asking yourself, when will students need this language in order to think and talk about the ideas that they're learning? So when will it be most relevant and useful, right? And you can ask yourself some of these questions. Does the word I want to introduce refer to something new that we'll be doing? Then you might teach the word as you're doing that. And there's an example up there. So you might teach the words graphing and graph as you introduce students to learning that representing data in mathematics uses those words. You might ask yourself, is this the name of a tool or object or image? Then you might teach those words to students as they use the tool or engage with the object or see the image. You can ask yourself, is this part of a name for something? And you can teach that when students are observing or exploring it. You can ask yourself, is this the word for a concept or a process and an idea? And you can teach that word to students as they begin to share their thinking. Or you can think to yourself, is this word going to show up in something that I read aloud to students, and will they need to know that? In which case you can embed that student-friendly definition into what you read as you read it. So let's think about our planning process and think about the vocabulary planning that you've already done with instructional strategies and introducing new words to students. If you want to expand that vocabulary support to all aspects of your classroom time, you want to be intentional about your planning. So I'm going to go over an example process and what that might be during an instructional unit on weather. So follow along. I might start with my learning objective. So there are different ways to describe weather, and I want students to observe and record the weather in our location. Then I want to identify the words and their student-friendly definitions that I think students are going to need in order to meet my learning target. So some of those words might be data, observe, record, weather conditions, sun, snow, wind, rain. And then I developed student-friendly definitions that I knew matched the context of my learning objective. Then you're intentional and you identify when you would introduce those words inside your lessons. So, during the read alouds I had planned, I have one called What's the Weather? And I see those words rain, wind, snow, and sun. So that's when I'm going to embed some of those. And when I have a lab that's planned and when I'm showing those materials right before students observe, I'm going to explain those words observe, data, and record so that they have them ready to go to practice in that task. And finally, ask yourself when students will have meaningful opportunities to use those words in a meaningful context, right? So if students are going outside to observe weather conditions and they have this recording sheet and they have space to draw or label or write, then I'm going to ask them some questions using some of those words that I want them to practice, right? What did you observe about the weather conditions? How did you observe this, right? What data are you observing about what you see outside in the world? Think about your process for planning and being intentional about the content that you teach the students in your classroom. And think, how can you embed vocabulary that you think is valuable into that process so that students have access to be introduced and to learn and to practice more about those words.